I don't want to interrupt important hugs and greetings that people are having amongst themselves. Welcome. I'm Michael Feuer. I'm, in my spare time, the Dean of the Graduate School of Education at the George Washington University, just a couple of blocks from here. But today, I think I'm very happy to welcome you on behalf of the National Academy of Education for this occasion to present what I consider to be a really tremendously interesting and I think to be useful report on something that we all care a lot about, international comparative assessments of education. So let me just start by, again, welcoming you to the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and to the National Academy of Education. I want to just say a special hello to our friend Mark Schneider. There you are. Mark, as many of you know, is the director of the Institute of Education Sciences designate. It is clearing all kinds of hurdles, the most recent of which was Senate confirmation. And any moment now, Mark will be the director of IES officially, and we're very proud of you, Mark, and looking forward to your service and to continuing the great work of the Institute for Education Sciences. It's nice to have you here. You're going to hear from others who were involved in the report, in particular from Judy Singer and Henry Braun. And we have panels of experts who have agreed to join us for this. I want to remind people that this session is being recorded, and that when you speak, you have to push a button on your microphone, even if you think you have a loud voice, because otherwise the recorder won't pick it up. So let me just then introduce one of our most distinguished government leaders, Peggy Carr, who is the Commissioner for Education Statistics and a great friend of ours of long standing. I think I may have said this once before, Peggy, in introducing you, but I still believe it, so I'll say it again. It's now 9 days or so until Americans will line up to submit their federal income tax returns. And when I do that, I am always thinking of people like Peggy as an example of why I like paying taxes. So maybe not quite as much as, but that's another conversation. But truthfully, Peggy represents the absolute top of the hill when it comes to service on behalf of the American people. So we're very grateful, Peggy. Come on up.
Thank you, Mike and Michael, always for a gracious introduction. As I meandered into the room today, I said something that really sort of correlates with your comment. These were dollars well spent. I would like to begin by thanking the committee for this truly distinguished opportunity. This report is really very rich and informative, and it will start the dialogue today, over the past 2 years, and again today, that I hope continues long after this report has been released to the public. The committee has studied a dazzling range of topics during this very valuable time, these series of workshops and other work. And I like to say that the recommendations and your thoughts are, they've been heard and they will be taken very seriously. I see so many opportunities for the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES. And I want to just take a moment here in my remarks to highlight a few examples of those opportunities that emerged as I reviewed your report. These are generally very exciting opportunities that NCS can and should pursue. For example, participation rates. We take seriously our responsibility to produce accurate data that are meaningful for our stakeholders. That's an ongoing challenge when it comes to participation rates, and we're working hard to improve them. Low participation rates are among the primary reasons that the relative costs of the administration of international assessments are so high, like TIMSS and PEARLS and PISA. Much of it is because there are substantial investments in resources, both in terms of cost and time of human resources and time to recruit samples that will allow us to report reliable empirical data. We have been implementing some changes in this regard to boost our participation rate, and today will be an opportunity for NCS to take stock and evaluate those initiatives in terms of how well are we doing thus far, and perhaps there are some immediate steps in light of your report that we should be taking advantage of. The categories that we are pursuing are 4. They include improving communication and messaging around a large-scale international assessment, better coordination between national and international teams within NCS, our staffs. Changes to operations like coordinating administration dates with statewide assessments to reduce burden on our schools in this country, and special incentives like the school-like reports that we now see emerging out of this cadre of international assessments, PISA, TIMSS, and PEARLS. So another area that I thought about as I read your report that emerged was in the area of socioeconomic status. NCS is hard at work trying to solve this problem of how to measure accurately this important construct. There have been a number of challenges that many of you can tell me about more than I can tell you in this area. And it has to do with the unreliability of student reports on parental occupation, parental attainment, education attainment, and then there's that free and reduced price lunch, this pesky free and reduced price lunch that is emerging and making us all scratch our heads. So here's one example that I thought you might find interesting that we're doing. NCS is currently undertaking an ambitious effort working with the census and other federal agencies to develop a new indicator of neighborhood poverty by applying special statistical techniques to household level microdata. In other words, we're trying to find a new way to make existing census poverty data more flexible for NCS by changing its form and turning it into a weather map. But instead of predicting temperature or rainfall at any location, this new map surface would allow someone to predict poverty at any location. Imagine that. So just a few years ago, Jack Buckley reorganized NCS, and he put all of the assessment activities, the national and international, in the same division. It was a great idea. And it sparked us to come up with another initiative I would like to briefly mention. We call it the NCS Integrated Assessment System. We even have an acronym for it. You know how we are, Washington, with acronyms. NIAS. The project aims to ensure that our large-scale assessments provide broader context for assessment data, the total picture in this country through linkages, through alignments and additional reporting variables. There's just so many opportunities to break down silos to be more efficient with this new vision. And I would be remiss if I did not say I like your recommendation around having a board to give us advice, to be sort of the independent reviewer of what we're doing and what we could possibly do around R&D activities. We know it works because it's been done before, and we support it. So in essence, there were a number of opportunities for NCS in reviewing this report, and I thank you again for your work, your tireless work. Is well appreciated. I look forward to the committee again, hearing what you have to say and the energetic discussion that I know we'll pursue today. Thank you, Mike.
So let me just introduce, it's one of those situations where actually somebody who doesn't need much introducing gets introduced by somebody who gets any chance to introduce himself. Anyway, it's a pleasure to introduce Judy Singer. And let me just point out something, and I think Judy will reiterate this. The report that you have that was issued, that's being issued today from the National Academy of Education, in the complex ecology of reports coming out of institutions like this, I just want people to understand, it doesn't necessarily represent the consensus view of the Academy, and recommendations or conclusions or findings that readers infer from the deliberations that are reported in this volume should just be taken as that, rather than as representing the decision of the Academy vis-a-vis the specific kinds of conclusions. So it may sound like a nuance looking for a context or something, but I think it's something for all of us to just keep in mind as we go ahead. Anyway, Judy Singer from Harvard University. Thank you, Judy, for all your great work on this.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Michael. And I really want to thank Peggy and everybody at NCES for their willingness to fund this project. That's a brave step to fund a project that is looking under the hood of your own agency and looking under the hood of a variety of assessments around the world and the openness with which NCES has approached it. So I think that is a very healthy sign for continuous improvement at NCES, and I suspect at other places around the world that are involved in international assessments. As Michael mentioned, this is not a consensus report. This is a report of a workshop. So what's in the report itself is essentially not a transcript, but what we believe is an accurate representation of the two workshops and the background papers that we commissioned. And I do want to recommend that you take the time to read the background papers. They're really quite interesting and stand alone as documents looking more deeply into some of these subjects. What Henry and I are going to do now is give you an overview of the report, but we're also going to throw in a little salt and pepper. As part of writing this report, we prepared a companion paper that just came out in Science today, okay, so hot off the press. It's really wonderful. It even has art, so you have it in the packet, but it's in black and white in the packet. The art is in color. And we're very pleased with this, in part because the report is a report of a workshop. The paper that comes out today in Science is they're Henry and my particular views. So just because something's in the report doesn't mean that we said it or we stand behind it. But if it's in this paper, we said it and we stand behind it. And so what we're going to do today is mostly hew to the report, but there are a few places where we're going to deviate just a little bit. So let me start by talking about what we came to term the ILSA ecosphere. So we use the acronym ILSA, International Large-Scale Assessments, to just try to have a single acronym that was short. We're in Washington, we need acronyms that could refer to these assessments in generally, as opposed to talking about specific PISA, TIMSS, PEARLS, PIAC, et cetera. And one of the things that became clear when we were planning the workshops is that what we call the ecosphere of ILSAs is enormous and broad. So on the one hand, we have what we call the producers, and that's many of the people who are in this room today, either in the audience or on some of the panels. We divide them into two broad groups: the sponsors, IEA, OECD, and also the contractors who actually do a lot of the work. But that's That's the most specialist group. We speak a common language. But in addition, there are professional consumers. So those run the gamut from policymakers and government officials, advocacy organizations and think tanks, and education researchers. Each of those constituencies has a different view on what ILSs are, what ILSs should be, what we see, how we interpret it. So each one of these constituencies sees these through a different lens. And then we have the broadest constituency, which are the general consumers, both traditional and new media outlets. And one of the things we did at the workshop was we invited journalists to be on the panels. And that was a very interesting set of insights into how the coverage of ILSs gets made. And there's a background paper by Nick Lemon, who is the former dean of the Columbia Journalism School. He's written a lot about testing and assessment, talking about the state of education reporting. I definitely commend that to you. Gives you a good sense of why we see what we see in terms of reporting. And one of the most startling statistics Nick gave at one of the workshops was that there will be soon more members of AERA than there are professional journalists. Just wrap your head around that. Newsrooms are just shrinking. So the burden, in fact, Henry and I were interviewed yesterday morning by several journalists covering the science piece, and having reporters who actually understand what these assessments are about, they're getting fewer and further between, which puts the burden on the producers to help those reporters transmit the information to the general public. I think this is a very important piece of the puzzle here. And obviously educators are interested, and so are parents and the public at large. These are, next week is going to be NAEP Day, and people are quite interested in what these assessments have to say. So the different constituencies have different concerns about the assessments. That's one of the things that came out, that depending upon where you sit in this ecosphere, you're going to focus on different concerns. So we start out by saying that everyone should worry about the accuracy of media reports and what we see as increasing overinterpretations and misinterpretations of the findings. And we'll give a few examples here. I'm sure everybody in this room has their pet example where the media covered one of these ILSs and did it in a way that did not hew to the true findings that a specialist would understand, but we can't expect the media to understand all the nuances that we're talking about. So we have a burden here to do some of that work for them. Policymakers obviously worry about increasing economic competition and insecurity. That's part of what drives the policymakers to think about policies for increasing the security, developing human capital in countries, and the relevance of the results to domestic education policy. When I say domestic, I mean domestic for every country, not just the United States. So the recommendations in both the report and in the science paper are not just aimed at the United States, and they're not just aimed at a particular subgroup. They're really for a broad set of recommendations. And obviously, the producers, and that's most of the people in this room, are worried about the capacity to add countries and jurisdictions. It's very expensive to conduct these assessments, and you add a country, and it adds a lot of cost, and it adds a lot of complexity. As Peggy was mentioning, the impact of increasing participation for data quality, that's both a question of participation rates within country, but also as you add countries, you're stretching organizations thinner. The challenges of increasing heterogeneity in languages, cultures, and economic development. If we think it's hard to measure SES in the United States, and we do, measuring SES cross-culturally in an appropriate way is a huge methodological problem. And we think that it is one that is worth tackling. It's not easy, but it is worth tackling because for these assessments to really be useful, both in terms of the first level of reporting, but also for secondary analysis, we have to tackle that puzzle. And there are cultural differences in the report. We talk a lot about measures of SES, and Leslie Rutkowski is here, was on one of the panels and did a background paper. And I commend that background paper to you also, because it talks a lot about measurement And we have another background paper specifically on background characteristics. So this is a puzzle worth tackling. I'm going to make reference to a trip I had in the fall to Singapore several times in the next few minutes. I was on a visiting committee for the National Institute of Education in Singapore. And for the first 2 days, we were miscommunicating constantly because they were talking about tuition, which I understood to be the fees people pay to go to school. But to them, when they were talking about tuition, they were talking about after-school tutoring. And the simple word tuition, the simple word tuition, which seemed so obvious to me what it meant, and it seemed so obvious to them what it meant, and we were talking completely past each other. It's sort of like being in a conversation with someone who's British, and you find that the private schools are actually public schools and vice versa. But that I knew. This tuition word was it's just an illustration of the complexity. And the trustworthiness of cultural and linguistic adaptations when they didn't know I didn't know what they were talking about, and I didn't know that they didn't know what I was talking about. And these are all people in education. These are professionals, and we were talking past each other. You can only imagine what it means for the development of an instrument where you'd measure background characteristics and you'd ask the children who are taking the assessments, do you have tuition? And in one country you'd get English speakers, you'd get totally different answers. So the report has 6 chapters, and we're just going to focus on 3 different aspects of it. We're going to start with the 6 purposes of ILSs, which we try to define and also talk about how well they accomplish those purposes. We'll give a few examples of reporting and interpretation, and then we'll turn to the 6 of the key messages that the report has, and actually 5 of them come from the report, and 1 of them comes from the science paper. So we're just taking advantage of being at the podium. So, the 6 purposes of ILSs. One of the realizations at the conferences was that with ILSs, even though there are research questions that are underlying them, in general, the data exist, and then we go looking for research questions. So it's a very backwards process from the way certainly the way I teach research design. Teach research design. What's your research question, and how do you design a study? That's the way you teach research design. Okay? With ILSs, it's, I've got some data. What could I learn? And so there's this disconnect between the research questions that we usually want to answer and the research questions that we can answer. And so in preparing this chart, which is in the report several different times, we try to classify the kinds of questions that are questions we want to answer, and here we talk a bit about how well ILSs are up to the task of actually answering them. So the simplest purpose is to describe and compare student achievement and contextual factors across nations, and this is what ILSs do rather well. Second purpose is to track changes over time in student achievement, contextual factors, and their mutual relationships within and across nations, and I would add, but not at the student level. This is aggregate data, and if we treat it as aggregate data, it does pretty well. Purpose 3, it does really well. Disturbing complacency about a nation's education system and spurring education reforms, we actually had excellent and we changed it to outstanding. They get attention. That's why we're all here. We realize that they get attention and we want them to be used well. The rest of the chart is going to come tumbling down, and instead of green, you're going to start to see various shades of red. To create de facto international benchmarking by identifying top-performing nations and jurisdictions, those making unusually large gains and learning from their practices, okay? This is the first level of red. Some of this is doable, but there have to be some caveats, and the caveats get lost. They get lost in the reports, they get lost by the reporters, and it puts a bigger burden on all of us to try to help the communication of these results in a way that is honest and fair. To evaluate the effectiveness of curricular instructional strategies and education policies, we would say with extreme caution, emphasis on the extreme. This is not what ILSs were designed for. They can suggest hypotheses. We would argue that those hypotheses should be generated and then investigated rigorously. And the last purpose, which is dangerously difficult, and some of us would say impossible, and some of us would say, well, maybe under some circumstances, is to explore causal relationships. And there's an example we give in the report that is a very nice paper that uses a regression discontinuity design to look at the effects of age at school entry on student achievement, using the cutoffs that countries have for whether you can enter kindergarten you have to be born by a certain date. And what's beautiful about that particular analysis is it's doing within-country analyses and then comparing them across countries. And those kinds of analysis we think are quite promising. The possibility that they're really causal, I think we have many more concerns about. So just to spice it up a little bit, let's have a few headlines. So we did a fair review of how ILSA results are generally presented, and the answer is rankings, and then more rankings, and then more rankings, and then some purported implication that comes from the rankings. This is a headline from NPR that we actually presented at the conference. U.S. students slide in global ranking on math, reading, and science. In fact, in the dates that were being referred to in this headline, the performance was static across time. The rankings changed because the number of countries participated changes, and people just don't understand that. This is a standard headline. Asia tops biggest global school rankings. The Asian success stories in the science paper, we spent a fair bit of time unpacking those East Asian success stories, and to the point that after you see about 6 concerns, I think you're ready to believe that you shouldn't believe the East Asian success stories. So this is from the BBC, and this is the way the headlines are written. Asia is on top. This one actually says Africa's on the bottom. I don't know that that was necessary. And the UK, since it's the BBC, is in 20th place. And because the US did even worse than the UK, it throws in the US because while we're not as good as Asia, we're better than the US. That's what these rankings are about. They call them league tables, which is based on the British version of rugby standings. And countries are not sports teams. And that's the way these rankings are presented. Why Singapore kids are so good at math. The city-state regularly tops global league table. What's the secret of its achievement? The secret sauce of its achievement. That's from the Financial Times. Well, one of the other things I learned in Singapore is there is one school of education. It trains all the teachers in Singapore. So just imagine having that level of control in the United States over teacher education. And there are more school districts in Massachusetts, my state, than there are schools in Singapore. So this notion of comparing a tiny city-state with that level of control with the entire US or the entire UK seems like a fool's errand. Britain turns to Chinese textbooks to improve its math scores. This headline came out in the New York Times as we were writing the report. Henry will refer to it a bit at the end. Britain has just rolled out an initiative this past summer. They're spending £41 million, that's $50 million, to translate the textbooks that are used in the Asian schools, the Mastery Math textbooks, and use them in English schools. And Henry will come back to that point at the end. In the last week, as we were preparing this talk, Henry happened to meet with some people from Teachers College who looked at how the Asian countries cover ILSA results. When we were doing the workshop report, we were limited linguistically to news outlets that were in English, basically. These people, Yue Zhang and Shinji Katsumoto, Teachers College, there was a project going at Teachers College to have students who could read the coverage in their home country's newspaper of ILSA results. So the first graph I'm going to show you, which is one of my favorites, and I'm sorry it didn't make it into print. This is from a Japanese newspaper. These are PISA results, and I'm going to focus on the purple. So if you look at the purple line there, you can see it's going up, right? Japan is doing great. Its rankings have gone from 6 to 5 to 4 to 2. Now take a look at the actual scores associated with the rankings. So in the 2015 PISA assessment, ranked number 2, score of 538. In the prior assessment, its ranking was lower, but its score was higher. In the assessment before that, it was even higher than the last assessment, but the ranking was lower. This is what the media are doing. They're taking the rankings as the outcome and saying that's what we should focus on, when we all in this room know that the rankings are misleading because they're also affected by these other factors. This is from Chinese Taipei. The results of PISA 2015 are released. The reading achievement, actually, they're talking about the ranking. They're not talking about achievement, but to people who don't know any better, achievement and ranking say the same exact thing. The achievement regressed to 7 years ago. Actually, the score was higher. So they're just totally misinterpreting it. And the explanation of the difference is, do you believe it? The falling of Taiwan in PISA reading is due to a lack of patriotism. Henry.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you again to the National Academy of Education, NCS, for giving us this opportunity. Let's see. There we go. So I'm going to just cut very quickly to some of the key points that came out of the workshop. But first, let me just, again, give some examples of some interesting illustrations of the impact that these large-scale assessments can have. In Ireland in 2009, they suffered a very precipitous drop in PISA scores, which caused national consternation. But they went about dealing with it in actually a rather reasonable way. They commissioned an international group of experts to come in, see whether it was really the PISA scale, was it other factors in terms of Irish education, and they ended up with quite a comprehensive and thoughtful analysis. But the main point really was that it caused such a shock in the system that finally, after a long delay on the part of the government, they finally implemented what was, from the educational point of view, a very reasonable literacy and numeracy strategy, focusing on issues like teacher education, curriculum and assessment, school inspections, and evaluation. So it had a positive effect, even though perhaps it was a bit of an anomaly. On the other hand, as Judy pointed out, in 2012, England had its PISA shock and in mathematics, and they, after a very small one-year study, they decided to spend the $50 million on importing math textbooks with the assumption, of course, that this was the secret sauce that was going to shift England's mathematics performance to the upper reaches. We'll have to see. So let's go quickly through some of the messages. One, as Judy's already pointed out, there's on the part of the workshop, there was a clear need, a clear interest in improving dissemination of ILSA results, helping reporters, helping media in general to understand the relationship between achievement and various contextual factors, the patterns of relationships, for example, the relationship between achievement and socioeconomic status, however described. That these are the kinds of things that really make a difference, and to try to de-emphasize these rankings, as we saw in the Japanese newspaper account and in Chinese Taipei, where rankings are equated with achievement. And we believe, again, on the part of the various committees, that we need to devote more resources to developing these media kits that will help reporters and, as I say, the public at large understand the context for education. As Judy said, we've been interviewed by some reporters. I happen to be interviewed by two reporters, one from England, one from Quebec, both of whom were science reporters who were just kind of detailed to deal with education on the side. So this is the kind of support that they need in order to properly do their job. And another point that came up was the need to have some mechanism to transfer from the research literature a lot of the excellent work that's being done in secondary analysis that has real policy relevance, but bring them to the attention of policymakers and the media as well. As Judy mentioned, one of the ideas that came up quite seriously at the meetings was the establishment, or one might think of it as a reestablishment of a national advisory board based on the experience we had with BICSI. It has, as you can see, some potential roles here. And I think in particular, the idea of having an outside group with the support of NCS, providing perhaps some creative, out-of-the-box thinking, but also providing perhaps a mechanism for bringing the secondary analysis research into policy relevant methods. We were all agnostic about how that might happen, but I think that's something, again, that perhaps could be an outcome of today's meeting. There was a lot of interest in trying to develop some ideas around longitudinal follow-ups of what are essentially cross-sectional studies. We had experts from other fields, health and human development, that talked about how longitudinal studies in their areas help to illuminate policy issues. We think the same thing could be true here in education. Perhaps some pilot studies about how longitudinal components could be used to augment current studies, but also, and perhaps more practically, to think about how countries can use ILSA samples as the foundation for longitudinal studies, and ideally to coordinate among countries in order to be able to continue the kinds of benchmarking comparisons that are so useful. As has been pointed out, we're in the transition phase to digitally based assessments. We have ePearls, eTIMS, PISA and PIAC moving towards computer-based assessments. That's going to have enormous consequences for the way in which ILSAs are carried out, and it has the implication, or the possibility, if you will, of improving both the quality of the cognitive instruments, the background questionnaires, and even field operations. So it's really an opportunity, I think, for us to rethink what we do in light of this shift from paper to computer. Another opportunity that was seen was linking the ILSA data files to other data files. And Peggy, you mentioned one initiative that you're taking on at NCS. In the Nordic countries, they have some examples already of linking ILSA data to their population registers. I know we have in this country some issues around privacy, which are very important, but it seems that there could be some ways, either directly or through some third party, to link ILSA data to national data, or create these small area estimates that could then be used to support secondary analysis around ILSA data. So it would, in our view, I think, improve not only the quality of the secondary analyses, but kind of give them greater standardization, which I think is really important, particularly when we're trying to make comparisons among different approaches to secondary analysis. And lastly, something that both Judy and I are very fond of thinking about, which is how ILSAs could be used to generate or stimulate, if you will, randomized field trials. As Judy mentioned, causal inference is sort of the holy grail, because after all, policy evaluation in the end is a causal question. But the question of whether we can use ILSAs as they are now to support these kinds of causal inferences is much debated, with, I think, the preponderance of evidence suggesting no. But it seems that it could be used, or ILSAs could be used, to structure follow-on randomized field trials. And coming back to the question in England, if they'd done a proper randomized field trial, they might have come to a different conclusion about how to spend that £41 million. But we believe that ILSAs already have experience in using randomized field trials to play with different approaches to carrying out their work. For example, mode effects, paper versus computer. We're thinking that we could apply that kind of technology, that kind of thinking, to more substantive issues. For all of the concerns that were expressed, I think that the general consensus at the workshops was that, in fact, the future of ILSAs is bright. They have helped us understand patterns of important relationships in cross-cultural contexts, led to generally constructive policy initiatives, and spurred countries to action in ways that otherwise might not have occurred. And we think that the advances in development, delivery, analysis, reporting that are coming will demand not only more research, but will lead to important improvements in domain coverage and accuracy, opportunities to leverage the very considerable global investment in ILSAs, and also more effective communication strategies to increase the public and policymakers' understanding of the messages that ILSAs are delivering. So let me invite Judy to the podium, and we'll share in our final statement that we all hope that this project, generously funded by NCS, reasonably generously funded by NCS, will strengthen the future of ILSA's, but it's our collective responsibility to see that it happens. So thank you very much, and thank you again for the support. Michael.
Yes, you can take your seats now. By the way, it said on the screen here that somebody named Connor Jett was talking. I'm not sure who that is, but I just want to remind you that that was Judy Singer and Henry Brown talking. Okay. Well, I'm almost tempted to try some of my own comments on this, but I will resist because we have some distinguished experts here with us, and I want to make as good use of your time and their time as we possibly can. So it's very interesting. The way this agenda was crafted, we're going to talk about two big buckets of issues that emerge from this kind of a study, this kind of analysis. One having to do with implications of ILSA's for policymaking, and the other panel will then focus on implications of ILSA's and of this work for the future of education research. And I just leave that as an exercise for all of you to contemplate how significant it is to be having this conversation in the headquarters building of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which is actually all about a now 2-century effort to translate scientific research-based evidence into useful policy meaning. And so what we're going to have here is an attempt over the next hour or so, a couple hours still left, to unwrap that and try to untangle a little bit these issues of policy and research. So our first panel is going to focus on policy issues, and we're going to take this in alphabetical order, if that's okay, starting with Tom Loveless. Anybody who's been involved in education policy, certainly in Washington, but I would say nationally and internationally, knows of Tom's very, very fine work. And as it says on the program, he is formerly of the Brookings Institution, but the Brookings Institution is formerly with Tom Loveless. So, Tom.
Thank you for having me. It's delightful to be here. I wanted to start by praising this report. It's really an amazing read, and it is so difficult. I've edited 7 volumes with a lot of different authors, and to be able to speak in one voice and to summarize so many different points of view and to do it in a coherent way is just quite an accomplishment. So I want to praise the editors. I'm not known for hyperbole, and some people would say I'm not known for praise. So I hope you'll take that seriously. Now, how does this thing work? Oh. Green button. Green button. Okay, very good. On the volume, what I'm going to do is focus on the conundrum part and talk about what I think is a key policy conundrum that plagues these international assessments, and then I'll offer a couple of ideas of my own. And I'm pushing the green button. There we go. I'll start with my favorite quote from the report, and it's this: "The research questions we want to answer and the research questions we can answer are often not the same." And this is really a problem that we have not just with international assessments, we have it with NAEP as well. We have it with all cross-sectional design in education. The research questions the public wants answered, and when I say the public, I also mean the public's agents, such as the press, such as politicians. They really have 3 burning questions. Number 1, why did we, and you can fill in the name of any country you want there, of country A, score so badly? Number 2, why did they, you can fill in the name of any country B we'll call it, score so much better? Number 3, what are they doing? What are they in country B doing that we in country A should be doing? Those are the questions that are always in the press. Those are the questions that the public thinks we're running all these assessments to answer. Now, there's a table in the report that discusses the various analytical strategies that are used by researchers using international data. Category 1 is the dominant category. It's just analyzing policy variation across countries. The first two strategies are both simply using cross-sectional data. Strategies 3 through 5 take that cross-sectional data and try to turn it into something longitudinal, and strategy 5 actually does, and it's very, very rare, use truly longitudinal data, but only a few countries have done this. Any causal warrant is going to be found towards the bottom of these strategies, not at the top, and yet almost everything that's done with the international data is in category number 1. The limitations, I pulled out 2 quotes from the report that discuss limitations of these assessments. First, from Sean Reardon, test scores are the product of the full set of experiences and opportunities a kid has to learn in his or her entire life, some of which happens in school, but a lot of that which happens outside of school, in the home, after school, and preschool. It also happens in many countries with tutoring that goes on, or what's known as shadow education. Hank Levin is even blunter. Levin stated, "These studies can only be correlational. They are not causal studies. They are not longitudinal at the student level. We need to keep that in mind because everyone here knows that. But then you go to the PISA results and the league tables, they are interpreted as being causal inferences drawn from certain countries." So you can see what the conundrum is. The policy conundrum is the public, press, and policymakers want ILSs to explain the causes of low and high achievement. And in the case of low achievement, to identify policy solutions, even though the assessments themselves are not able to do so. So what good are they then? When I talk to reporters and they interview me and I say, now look, we can't determine anything. Peggy and I had a webinar on NAEP just 2 days ago. And you get the question, well, what good are these things? We spend all this money and effort. If you can't tell what's going on in terms of causes, what good are they? Well, I think we need to be very emphatic. There are still 2 very important things that they accomplish. First, monitoring national achievement is worthy by itself. Most homes have a thermometer in the medicine cabinet. It can't diagnose, it can't identify causes, but it can raise an alarm if something is going wrong. And then second, and this came up in Judith's talk and Henry's, they're good for hypothesis building. So what they can do is alert policy analysts to promising topics needing more rigorous causal design. So then we can run RCTs or quasi-experimental designs. I think an RDD was mentioned by Judith. And then we can get at getting causal inferences that have more standing. So there are 2 ideas. I want to endorse both of them. I'm skeptical of the power of the first, but I'll mention it. Idea number 1 is the organizations that administer ILSs and release results would be wise to devote greater resources to preparing reporters and providing more guidance on what can and cannot be inferred from results. Now, I agree with this, but I think it would have been more powerful had it been suggested in 1960. Today's journalists, first of all, anyone who has a keyboard is a journalist. All they need is a keyboard and an internet connection. So it's worth a try doing this, but frankly, I'm very active on social media. I'm active on Twitter. I've actually tried to explain causality on Twitter, which I urge no one to attempt. It's not a fun thing. So the new media just doesn't follow these old rules. So that's where my skepticism comes from. Number 2, I put more faith in. People have mentioned Bixie, which was an outfit here in the US. It was a group of advisors here in the US on international assessments. Idea number 2 from the report: an impartial national board could be created and charged with providing ongoing guidance on ILSA design, analysis, reporting, and interpretation. I'm in favor of guidance, but not so much on design, analysis, or reporting, because the problem then is you get too many cooks in the kitchen. And both IEA and OECD PISA, they're running very complex operations, and what they don't need is like 80 people telling them what to do. The second thing I would say, though, is I don't think this should be rooted at the national level. It has to be kicked up to the international level, or it won't have any effect. The United States, for us to try to do it here at the national level, the concerns that are raised in this report are shared by scholars in other countries. So I think we need really an international body to be created to begin by issuing a document that just lays out principles of interpreting evidence. You know, here are the principles of interpreting evidence from international assessments. And then what I would do is also create some kind of standing committee so that the principles have bite. A standing committee that of international scholars to review reports and call out gross violations of the principles. So even if the gross violations are coming from OECD PISA or from IEA or from the New York Times or from a politician, we need a standing committee that says, look, that's just wrong. You cannot take that causal inference from these particular data. And I think if it were international and completely separate from the organizations that conduct the tests, it would have more influence. Finally, I'll conclude with this. I do think we need to consider governance, and that's one thing that's not in the report. Researchers must have a more prominent role in governing OECD PISA and IEA. And I don't mean simply an advisory role. Both of the organizations have advisory panels of scholars. But I'm talking about in making actual governance decisions, okay? Think about the history of these tests. IEA was founded and governed by educational researchers. Politicians weren't involved in that. Government officials weren't involved in that. The researchers started this entire project. But today, 50 years later, government officials dominate both IEA and OECD PISA. IEA has some representation in the General Assembly from researchers. I represented the United States for a number of years in the General Assembly of the IEA, and there are other researchers from other countries that do as well, but I'd say it's 20 to 25% of the body itself. There's a consequence of this evolution from a researcher-based, researcher-governed set of assessments to one that's now run by either politicians or their representatives from governments. The consequence is this: those who create educational policy and are held accountable for policy success wield power over international efforts to gather information on national systems performance. And so the conflict of interest there is obvious. The research community needs to take a more robust, rigorous role in the actual governance of the assessments. And I'll stop right there.
Thank you very much, Tom. I know people probably want to get in on the conversation already, but I'm going to ask your indulgence a little longer, and I'm also going to make two executive decisions since I was asked to moderate this thing. The first is that we're going to ask Pablo to speak next out of alphabetical order because he has to leave a little bit earlier. And second, in hopes that we can keep him here as long as possible, I'm going to suggest that we actually not take a full-blown 10-minute break as on your agenda, but that we keep going. And if people want to tiptoe out there and get yourselves coffee or whatever it is and bring it back, do that. But let's keep this going. So now it's a pleasure to introduce Pablo, a friend who works at the Inter-American Development Bank, with his perspectives on this. Thank you, Pablo.
Thank you, Michael. And it's an honor to be here. This is an amazing room, and I'm actually looking forward to hearing from everyone. So I'm going to try to be brief and provide you with what I think is the perspective from middle-income countries. I'm sure that Andreas is going to talk a lot about numbers. I'm going to try to bring in the human side to all of this. One of my favorite sayings was from a minister from Africa who said, policies are made in heaven, but they're all implemented on earth. So I always try to keep that in mind. And I will emphasize a little bit what these middle-income countries are doing with these studies as well, which I think is also relevant and useful for other countries. So let me jump right into it and try to provide a balanced view on the policy implications and why I think these tools are useful for policymakers. There are huge opportunities with participation in these assessments and in these countries. And we'll hear a lot about raising awareness just about the importance of education, bringing attention to learning and to actually spending the much needed resources on education. They also provide you with some high-level diagnostic of what the strengths and weaknesses in a particular country might be. But where I really want to focus on is the learning process that they offer. For many of these countries, the capacity they build by participating in projects that are 4 or 5 years long and that take a huge effort. There are very few projects in these ministries that take for so long. And used well, they help middle-income countries and a lot of countries build capacity not only on measurement, but also on policy making, and perhaps even more importantly, on how to communicate the results and their efforts to a wider public. There is a lot of work that ministries have to do, and they're not particularly good at communicating with teachers, communicating with the schools administrators, communicating even with regional authorities. And so these efforts offer them an opportunity to do that and to learn, most importantly, not only from the amazing work that is done in these sponsors, but also from the contractors, right? There are incredible opportunities there for them to interact with people that they would really not necessarily meet on a day-to-day basis, and that would not be available to them were they trying to improve their own system on their own. But even beyond that, the opportunity that is offered for learning, the most important opportunity for learning is learning from one another. You get the opportunity to sit with people who are doing exactly the same thing that you're doing in a different country, who are facing exactly the same challenges or very similar ones, and you sit with them on a regular basis, once, twice, 3 times a year to discuss. You establish relationships, and those relationships stay, for a really, really long time. Obviously, these efforts also come with challenges. I am sure we're going to spend a lot of time talking about misuse, distractions, the fact that they only come, every so often. But for me, and the one that I want to emphasize, is just getting visibility. Of course, we all think they are extremely important, but most people, even in education ministries, have no idea what these assessments are, what they're for, and how they can be useful. You spend half of your time trying to explain, really what the benefits are, and trying to get the results and the lessons that come from them out there to a wider public, but also to your general education community. For me, and this is rarely emphasized, so I really wanted to emphasize this, the biggest policy impact these assessments have is a change on the policy-making culture. In most countries, you don't have policies that are based on evidence. They're based on something else, or they're very rarely based on evidence. And here you have an opportunity to produce evidence, imperfect, maybe not complete, very limited, but the inspiration is there. Most importantly, also, perhaps, it's the fact that they shift the focus of policy from input to output. They really put the focus on what kids are learning in schools, what they can do with that, with what they're learning, and that is huge. Most ministries are focused on building schools, teacher training, and various other things that have obviously are very important for education and very important for what happens in schools, but they're not necessarily focusing on that. And obviously, they also offer you an opportunity to be open, to look outside of your own country, your own region, and to learn from what others are doing in terms of education policy. So the one thing that I want to leave you with, and this has already been mentioned today, is that this is a tool, right? You can use it, you can abuse it, or you can simply ignore it, right? And most of the time, most people ignore it, and they do not make the best out of the opportunities they have by participating in this. So the advice that we give countries all the time is, if you're going to participate, don't participate just to be on the picture. Take full advantage of the opportunities that these assessments offer you. Engage as much as you can with everyone that is participating, with the contractors, with the sponsors, and really benefit from it by taking full advantage and learning through that entire process. It's 5 years, so you have plenty of opportunities to do that. And I wanted to end with a few, some comments on the recommendations that are in the report. And my reading of it is that the recommendations are simply not ambitious enough. So, I would urge you to be a lot more ambitious, and this is how. The report, talks a lot about, less rankings, and I think we all in this room agree that is needed. But what is really needed is more nuanced analysis in general. We probably used less than 10% of the data and of the knowledge and of the opportunities for research that are in these assessments. The money that is spent collecting these data is 10 times more than the money that is spent in analyzing the data once we have it. And now we have it for a really long time, right? And there is not only all these international assessments, there is also the national assessments that we spend very little money analyzing. The report calls also for more links, and I'd say, start with links to national assessments, like NAEP. And a lot of countries are doing this. A lot of countries have student IDs that allow them to follow students from the moment they come in pre-primary education to the moment they leave university. And that is a very easy thing to do in some countries. In others, obviously, they're more difficult. But they allow you to build those links that are needed. The digital assessments are going to be a game changer, obviously. And this means, we're going to be able to assess more often, but more broadly. And this is critical. I mean, we're talking about studies here that use samples. Most countries in the region where I work, the Latin America and the Caribbean, actually want to assess everyone. They do census assessments. Why? Because it's a hugely important issue to include everyone, to make sure that everyone feels included and has a voice, right? So you really want to take advantage of that, take advantage of the digital assessments, and make sure you're doing this very often. The assessments are most useful when you do 2, 3, 4 in a year. And there is no reason why we shouldn't be taking advantage of technology. The issue about longitudinal add-ons, that, I think it's been tried before. It's extremely hard. Very few countries do it. And in the ones that they were available, they've disappeared because they're simply too hard. So I would argue, keep and build on those links to other assessments that you already have. And the last one that I want to comment on is stimulate randomized field trials. I think these assessments are doing a fantastic job at experimenting and innovating. There are countries that maybe because they have less resources, maybe because this is a much more important effort for them than it is in a country like the US, they are making a lot more use of these data and of these opportunities. They are testing with the same assessment. They are testing, for example, in the case of PISA, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds. They're looking at the data at the item level. They're using that to feed back into either teacher training, learn from that. There is a lot of experimentation and a lot of innovation around this that is happening all across the world. It's just very little, it's not publicized that much because it's done at the country level. So in general, let me conclude with that. I think the report is fantastic. I really like the fact that it was very well balanced, and my only want in reading is that it's a little bit more ambitious. Thank you. Thank you,
Pablo, if I just might ask, what is your time situation? Because I want to make sure that you're still here in case people want to ask you a couple of questions.
10:45. I need to be there.
By 10:45. Decisions. Okay, let's go to Andreas, who will speak for 12, 15 minutes, right? Andreas Schleicher. This is Andreas Schleicher. And I just want to say, in the world of international assessment, you don't even need the last name. You just have to say Andreas, and everybody knows who we're talking about. Welcome.
Thanks very much. And I want to congratulate the authors for what I think is a very thoughtful report with lots of really good advice. And I think that's exactly what we need to move the kind of ILSA agenda forward. Some of the challenges that the report comes up with are already in the works. I think I can point to a few things. Others are very, very difficult, very hard to assess. And there are yet other issues where I can only speak for PISA. PISA has made strategic design choices in order to do some things well, rather than everything a little bit. And I'm going to defend those kinds of design choices. Sometimes we have the temptations to build cars that can also fly and swim, and often we end up with things that, become very expensive but don't serve the purpose. So I'm going to defend those kinds of design choices and also point you to some of the trade-offs that we really need to consider. First of all, I think the report rightfully points out that we need to become better in measuring the covariates, the constructs in the background question. I think it's a very good point, but it can become at the expense of measuring the outcomes. And I think this is a very, very difficult kind of choice, and where PISA has struggled from the outcome. Fortunately, there is a move towards improving measurement of the questionnaires. You make the point, and I think that's a very good one, you need to compare apples with apples. It's more interesting to compare Massachusetts with Singapore than to compare the United States with Singapore. That has been done, in fact. Most federal countries now have state-level data in PISA, so you can actually do those kinds of comparisons if you wish. But again, larger samples often come at the expense of higher quality in measurement. There are trade-offs between, validity and efficiency. If you maximize validity gains, you may pay a higher price. If you put your focus on efficiency gains, you may compromise validity gains. This is a real conundrum. There is a kind of authenticity and reliability. There is a tension between those constructs. And again, larger samples that you call for are desirable, but we're not willing to pay the cost of lower quality in measurement. And then, there's this question, how does PISA or international assessments relate to other forms of instruments? Now, in our view, actually, the greatest value is to generate new insights, new hypotheses, sometimes on the nature of relationships, pointing us to things that we didn't expect. Who would have looked to Singapore or Shanghai or Finland without having ILSAs? This is the value of this. And who would have looked to Massachusetts without having NAEP? So I think that's very important. And if you would actually design those ILSAs to focus on, the causal nature of the relationship, you would actually, first of all, have to be clear about what questions you answer. From the outset, you have to constrain your design, and you pay a heavy price for this. So I think it's a very, very important kind of trade-off. No? Sometimes, we have very high standards on statistical significance. Now, that's what all ILSAs do, actually. Most kind of scientific studies do that. But you pay a price. Often you make type 2 errors that you're not aware of. No? You think, there is no relationship if there is actually one. So again, getting that balance right is absolutely not straightforward. One of the biggest challenges is, some people say if you want to measure change, you cannot change the measures. No? But if you don't change the measures, you very quickly lose relevance. Mathematics is a great example. The way we use mathematics today is very different from the ways in which we used mathematics 10, 20 years ago. So we've got to change the constructs. We've got to change the measures. And I think this is a conundrum. I think no easy answers. What we do is we have now bridging studies for content and delivery to figure out, what impact they have. But we believe that, relevance is more important than just sticking to what was important in the past. You want to be as comparable as possible, but as country-specific as necessary. And actually, a lot of progress is being made, which I don't find sufficiently acknowledged in the report. For example, PISA has gone adaptive now. We can actually basically tailor the assessment to the individual needs of countries and students to some extent. That's going to continue. I think it's a very important development. We have also made greater investments in more modular context questionnaires, ensuring that they capture the nuances of specific country contexts. Integration with links with national assessments is something that we've been working on. Many countries are doing this now. They are able to triangulate between national metrics of success, the NIP kind of construct, and the PISA construct. So I think this is an area where I put lots of things in green because I think there's a lot of real good work being done to ensure that the systems become more responsive to individual needs. And then there's one point that's perhaps the hardest part. Actually the outcomes depend on the nature of the construct that you assess. I'll give you one example. If you take a test like TIMSS, the Russian Federation always comes out very high. You take a test like PISA, the Russian Federation comes out very low. And in their own right, both assessments are right, but they look at different things. And you need to be conscious. And that's actually countries, in both kinds of studies, they do very extensive validation studies. It's a difficult process of consensus building, and I think you have the same in national assessments like NAEP. These are very difficult choices. You need to be aware the choices that we make do have implications. Actually, I can show you some data on this, which sort of explains this. We actually do know why, the Russian Federation doesn't come out so well on PISA, because PISA doesn't have a lot of tasks in there which you can answer simply by the memorization techniques. As you get to the right end of the scale with more complex PISA tasks, those kinds of learning strategies are poorer predictors for task performance. If you want to do well on PISA, you have to be focusing more on the kind of complex problem-solving tasks, elaboration strategies, as we call them. So those things actually do matter. Fortunately, for most countries, like the United States, it's not much of a difference. But for some countries, you can actually argue they are penalized by one or the other approaches of assessment. You do get different answers. We've got to be conscious about those kinds of things. And that brings me to the first chapter in the report, interpretation in the reporting. I think our challenge is always to keep things as simple as possible, but as complex as necessary, and also as comparable as possible, but as country-specific as necessary. Now, some pointers I want to make on the comparability of samples. It's an ongoing road. I think if you look from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, a lot of improvements have been made. I think we now have samples where the errors are well in the range of measurement errors. In fact, I would argue that the measurement problem is much bigger now than the sampling errors. Coverage issues, now that's a big issue always. You do actually test everybody in a population, or are some students not enrolled in school? It's always been a conundrum. And actually, we address this. For example, we now have PISA complements that look at students who are not enrolled in school so that we can actually know something about the people who are not covered. So I think that's something done. As I said, the comparisons become more meaningful by greater granularity in the assessments. And we invest in facilitating and supporting use of PISA data. The one thing I just want to say, the quality of the media coverage actually, if you look at this early years of PISA now, has improved very significantly. Yeah, you get lots of, noise in the media, but you do get this for anything else. It has nothing to do with ILSA. This has something to do with the media. But you do get a lot of quality coverage. Judith, you cited a sort of headline from the BBC. What you didn't cite is the many documentaries the BBC has produced and broadcasted on PISA and international comparisons, going into great detail. I actually think the BBC is a great example for very nuanced and sophisticated media coverage. And I think that's something that we didn't see in the early days. In the early days, we had the rankings. Today, I think we have very nuanced coverage. Now, when it comes to policy uses and limitations, the perfect can often be the enemy of the good. You know, this is the world that we actually cover with studies like PISA. How would the world look if we wouldn't have PISA or international comparisons? If I use the example of my own country, Germany, you know, before PISA, every state did its own little thing. There was no way of measuring actually education progress. Results, you know, nobody knew about them. Came out the results from PISA, the country did a lot worse than people hoped and expected they would do. And that has spurred huge changes that would have been totally unthinkable without those comparisons. Nobody in Germany would have even talked about creating a system of, you know, national standards for education, building a kind of curriculum framework. Schools did what they liked. Now this is existing. Nobody would have talked about closing the achievement gap. If you look at the results from PISA and PISA 2009, the achievement gap between privileged and disadvantaged students has shrunk by almost 50%. Because people did something to do about it. Why didn't they do that before PISA? Because everybody thought that's inevitable. It's not something that you can do something about it. PISA has actually highlighted there are countries that are doing a lot better on this, and the country's got its act together. It has actually moved forward. It's a lot of inactions. You know, one question is, you know, whether ILSAs meet the research requirements, you know, of randomized controlled trials. They will never do that. They're not designed to answer causal questions. But I think the bigger question is, what would be the state of education and knowledge about education if we wouldn't have those kinds of assessments? No? Many scientific revolutions have started with good measurement. Some have started with experiments, but actually many actually started out with measurement. So what can we say about this? First of all, those assessments show what is possible in education. They got people to look upwards. And actually, Judith, I want to follow up on the example that you have given with Britain, looking at textbooks in Shanghai. In fact, you know, the high performance of Shanghai has got the British Minister of Education visiting the province. He was actually very skeptical what she could learn from Shanghai. She was a former math teacher. She went into many classrooms, and she was actually deeply impressed by what she saw. What she did is she invited 50 teachers from Shanghai to come to Britain. That was a kind of small-scale experiment. Today, 6 years later, there are 30 mathematics hubs in Britain bringing together Chinese and British math teachers to think about how we teach math. I think this is a fantastic result that would have never happened without those kinds of assessment. People start to look beyond the borders. They also place national standards into a broader perspective. Brazil was the first non-OECD country knocking on our doors, you know, wanting to be part of this assessment. And when they did this, I asked myself, you know, why would they want to do this? No? They will come out at the bottom of the league table. Actually, I spoke with President Cardoso in those days, and actually he said, well, you know, I know where we are going to come out. The problem in my country is not that I don't have money or anything. The problem in my country is that everybody thinks education is great. You know, we're doing fine. No? Students get good marks, teachers get, you know, good grades. Everybody's happy. There's nothing that's changing. They did come out 41 out of 41, the ranking, and that is exactly what got the country to move. If you look at the results for Brazil today, it's a great example of great policy improvement over years based on those kinds of ranking. You know, and I actually, the one point I really beg to disagree, that, you know, looking at absolute improvements in performance is more important than the rankings. Both have their own right. You know, and it gives you the analogy of economics. You know, we've all become wealthier than we were in the 1960s and 50s. But those countries that became wealthier faster have a huge advantage that makes a huge difference for the lives of people. And I think this is exactly the same in education. Just becoming better is one thing. The question is, you know, are we catching up with the rest of the world? And that is what the rankings tell us. They are not everything. In fact, for our PISA reports, we devote 10 pages to rankings and 1,000 pages to analyzing them. I still believe they have their place, they have their importance. We can expose grade inflation. There are many national tests where happily people see year to year things get better. Come ILSAS, and we suddenly see sometimes outcomes are flat. That is a very important finding. We keep education systems honest. We can contextualize curricular choices. Now, the example I showed, Russia versus other countries. We can lower the cost of political action. I give you the example of Japan. Very interesting. They came out quite well on PISA, but they didn't come out as well as Singapore and Shanghai. And they asked themselves, what are we doing less well than those countries? And they found actually they were not so good in tasks that required students to respond to open-ended tasks, so they had to produce knowledge. They were great in reproducing knowledge, not as good in producing knowledge. They tackled those kinds of things, and that's very difficult to do in a kind of context where parents and teachers all push against it. They used these kinds of results to galvanize action around us. And of course, the German example is a great tool, sort of how you can actually also raise the political cost of doing nothing. So I think those things have actually very important. I just conclude with a couple of points. This is sort of the kind of most popular chart in PISA, looking at outcomes versus equity. It shows countries where they stand, and we can actually show how things are changing, and both perspectives, including the ranking, are very important. Take the results from Brazil. It's typical kind of PISA analysis, gets covered a lot in the media. On the horizontal axis, social economic background of schools, on the vertical axis, outcomes, and you can see really how, as schools become wealthier or are in wealthier contexts, neighborhoods, they do better. And the private schools on the right side, do really well. In the national context, without ILSA, you look at this and say, well, maybe I have to become rich first before I can come better, or I have to send my child to a private school to do better. That's the national perspective. But then you compare that with a country like Vietnam. And suddenly you see, oh, well, the schools in Vietnam are also poor, but they're doing a lot better than the schools in Brazil. So again, those are the kinds of points of reference that are really very powerful. And you can say comparing apples with oranges. This is the performance of learning outcomes by decile of social background in the United States. You can see the big achievement gap. Everybody talks about it. The question is, can you do better? And again, comparing with Singapore may not be appropriate, but we look at the 10% most disadvantaged students in Singapore, same kind of social background, and they do better. Or the 10% of the students in Shanghai, they do a lot better. So again, we can do meaningful comparisons of apples and apples, which I really believe are very, very important. And that's sort of my really last point, generating hypotheses. We can analyze policy variation among countries. This is a chart showing you the relationship between outcomes and spending. Some people say, well, if you want to do better, you have to invest more money in education. Maybe, but what this chart shows policymakers very clearly is that's not, there's no automaticity in that relationship. It's actually very complex. There are a lot of countries that don't spend very much and still get good outcomes. So again, these are the kind of hypotheses that we are able to generate with this. Whether we can find causal answers to this, that's not where ILSAs have their place. They are complements, not substitutes for other research methods. We do have some longitudinal studies. The Canadians did this, the Danes did this, the Australians did this. We can actually do some of the research with longitudinal studies. But again, I believe we should keep those kinds of assessments on what they do best. And that is actually generating ideas and hypotheses, and use other types of surveys, instruments to solve the question of what's the nature of those kinds of relationships. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas. Fascinating. Thank you very much, Andreas. This is great. And I must say, if there were an international comparative assessment of slides, I think Andreas would rank among the top 5 easily. That's beautiful work. Thank you. Okay, we're going to take some time now for conversation. And if I might, I want to ask you if you have in particular questions that you'd like Pablo to address before he has to leave, that would be helpful. But, and please try to frame this as questions and not op-ed columns. Judith Tarney-Perda. If you don't mind also just identifying yourself so that if you push the button, it should go on. We forgot to mention that you should bring your own batteries.
Thank you very much. I'm Judith Purda. I retired recently from the University of Maryland, and actually this month represents 50 years that I have been working with IEA. Began with something called the Lake Mohonk Conference. And I want to bring a perspective, I think, as much as I want to ask a question. Maybe I ask for reactions, but what you said reminded me of this, Pablo. What hasn't been talked about much here, and I was on the committee, and it was part of the deliberation, but it didn't get as much attention perhaps as I thought it should, was the role of attitudes in the whole process. And I'm going to talk about two kinds of attitudes. In the first place, there were 4 IEA civic education studies, which I had something to do with starting in 71, 99, 2009, and 2016. And attitudes were outcomes in those studies. And they have been extremely interesting, I think especially in Latin America. We were discussing earlier, and people have really latched on to the idea that it isn't just what you know. And the second aspect of attitudes I'd like to point out is the importance of school and classroom climate. This is the one thing we found in all of these studies, that is the students report on how discussion, is there respectful discussion in their classrooms? Do they have something to say about how the school is run? And those dimensions, I think, are too often ignored in the kind of work that we do. And it gives us insights into what to do other than changing the curriculum, which may or may not have, may go out of date or may have other emphases that are good emphases, but it takes a long time, and in many cases the other things may be more changeable. And we recently looked at our data and found that there are more than 100 articles reporting secondary analysis of these civic education studies in the journal literature. And I think maybe 2 of them dealt with cognitive outcomes. The groups that interested in school change among political scientists, sociologists, and others have picked up on the attitudinal, both dimensions of the school and dimensions of the outcomes of education. And I think that's a dimension that we shouldn't forget. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Judith. Do any of the panelists, especially Pablo, want to weigh in on this conversation now about the role of attitudes and classroom climate as it affects both the methods and the interpretations of these kinds of assessments?
Let me just say one very brief comment, and I think you're putting the emphasis right on the right spot. And so my comment is simply that a lot of effort in these studies, maybe 80, 90% of the effort goes into the cognitive, and very little goes, or, in my view, not enough goes into the questionnaires. And both issues you mentioned come from the questionnaires, and they're hugely important. And, they deserve a lot more attention. I agree.
Do either of you, Tom or Andreas, want to respond to Judith's point on this? Not now. Other comments, questions, considerations, conundrums?
Is this on? Okay.
Yes.
Adam Steiner from the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. I had a question kind of building on that question about attitudes and non-cognitive stuff. There's been some studies in the last couple of years from the University of Arkansas. Several researchers have done work on this. And then in an experimental framework, Sally Sadoff and Yuri Nisi at UC San Diego and some of the Chicago economists have done some stuff looking at the extent to which test scores are driven by non-cognitive elements. So looking at international context, some students just try harder on the test. It's a no-stakes test for them. And so in making comparisons, you're picking up both cognitive things. Some students are better at math than other students, for example, and also non-cognitive things. Some students are just trying harder on the test. And so one of the implications of this is that in the East Asian context, kids actually score really high on this non-cognitive thing. They're working harder on it, and so it affects these rankings. So I was curious how the future of these assessments, if the should build on those new findings, finding out that actually there's a lot of measurement error that is just based on the fact that students are trying at different levels, and whether that's just an argument for not comparing across countries or if there's other ways forward.
Tom.
Yeah, there was a wonderful experiment run with students. It was an RCT, randomized control trial, with students from the United States and students, I believe they were from Shanghai. And the kids were given a test, and the control group, they were just given a test under normal conditions. In the treatment group, they were offered an incentive, payment, money. The American kids in the treatment group scored significantly higher. The kids in the Shanghai group did not. It really didn't change their performance at all. So I think you're right. We don't know enough about the influence of incentives and motivation in terms of test performance. I would take that finding from that study, from that experiment, and say there's probably a much larger batch of, call them cultural, psychological influences on these test results that we don't know a lot about, but it's really a fruitful area of inquiry.
Yeah, I agree with this. I think we are focusing a lot on, errors of sampling, and they're actually probably small now with the improvement of the studies compared with those kinds of measurement issues here. The big question to ask ourselves, and our intention is really to keep PISA low stakes, because we're really interested not what students can do under extreme conditions when they're highly paid, but what do they do under normal conditions? Because that's the test of truth in life, And in fact, you have to ask yourselves, is this an artifact of a testing situation, or is it really about the behavior of people at life? And I think that's what we are interested in. So it may be influenced. Some people may try harder in tests, and some people may try harder in life, Try to take a flight with United Airlines to Singapore and come back with Singapore Airlines, Tell me how the staff actually treated you. I think those are questions that may not just be a situation of what we do in a specific testing situation, but attitudes of people towards life, and that's what we're really interested to capture.
Sorry, isn't that a kind of measurement error?
Yeah.
The PISA is not supposed to be a measure of what kind of a person you are. It's supposed to be, to the extent it's a math assessment, it's supposed to measure that.
I'm sorry, I can't get this on. It's supposed to measure cognitive math ability, and so, it seems like it's just measurement error, and maybe a lot of it, if it has to do with how hard you're trying on the test. The United Airlines example, I don't really see how it applies.
I think that's the question. Do you try to measure sort of the ideal cognitive ability in math, or do you measure math performance in a non-stakes, low-stakes situation? I think that's really what we can get from those international assessments, and that's the normal day of students. No. So, but on your point, actually, we did experiments on that. We had in 4 countries where we actually tried various incentive structures. In fact, the money was not even the most powerful one. The most powerful one was usually when those scores counted to, school marks. And actually, the results were not as different as you would expect. Actually, we did not find major effects in the 4 countries where we did those kinds of studies. We also survey students on their attitudes. We have something that we call the test barometer, where we actually ask students, how hard did you try with this test compared with your national exam and so on. So those results are all available, where we can look into those issues to some extent. But I would still argue I'm most interested in the math performance students can do in a normal kind of situation.
Let me just add one little thought in there, and also take advantage of the opportunity to say goodbye and to say how sorry I am that I have to leave. But I think the move to digital assessments is going to help us a lot with that, and is going to capture a lot more data on what the students and how the students are interacting with the test. And so I would urge everyone to try to exploit those opportunities as much as possible and build on them, because it's a very new field. We know very little about it, and that particular issue would be a great opportunity to do something that is recommended in the report, which is built on the field trials. There are huge field trials in all of the countries that participate, so take that opportunity to do that. And again, I'm really sorry I have to go. It was great. It was fantastic. Thank you. inviting me.
Well, thank you for being with us, Pablo. Good luck. We'll see you soon again. Tom wanted to get in on this conversation.
I just wanted to underscore, as a policy analyst, I don't want to have confounding variables in my analysis that will confuse me and lead me astray as to the proper intervention. So, for example, let's take the textbook issue in Great Britain. It's quite possible there are non-cognitive confounding factors that have led to this huge gap between UK scores and the scores in these other countries. And if you think it's textbooks and it's actually something else, you're going to spend a lot of money on an intervention that is simply not going to work. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that kids need to be taking these assessments under realistic environments, and I think that's Andreas's point. However, let's not confuse ourselves about what we need to do to come up with interventions that will then be promising.
Again, please identify yourself. Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Rutkowski, Indiana University. I'm curious, and I guess for both of you, I'd like to hear your perspectives on this. Andreas, you said that you want to keep PISA a low-stakes assessment, but yet you also said that PISA takes away excuses from countries. So it seems like, in that sense, it's a high-stakes assessment, especially for participants. So maybe can you expand on that a little?
Yeah, actually, I mean, it's a good point. It's a high-stakes assessment sort of for policymakers at the national level. It's still low stakes for students. That's why we draw samples and not test students universally. It's very kind of, even if we could, we wouldn't do that. The moment you make it universal, the stakes for students in schools are rising. Sample-based assessment, there's no consequence for the individual students. That's sort of the answer to that. I think the question on attitudes is real, and that's why we survey students' attitudes to test taking and those kinds of things. We have actually data on it. I think the point that Pablo also made, we're now able, since 2015, actually to track every mouse click from students. You can see when they start to sort of make erratic choices or get bored and so on. So I think we're going to get a lot more insights into this, but the point really is we keep it low, the stakes low for the individual student, and particularly for the school.
Okay, I think since I don't see a lot of other hands, I'm wondering if Judy or Henry would like to just add a little coda to this part of the conversation, or would you prefer to wait until, you'll wait till the end? Okay. In that case, join me in thanking Andreas and Tom, and we're going to ask the second panel to come up here. And we're still on this plan of no formal break, but if you did need to take a break, this would probably be the best time to do it. Okay, folks, welcome back. It's a pleasure to introduce now our panel that's going to focus a little bit more on issues of methodology and research. We have three panelists, one of whom is almost at the table, but when I mention Ina Mullis's name, she will speed over to take her seat. There she is. Good. Ina Mullis from Boston College, Leslie Rutkowski from Indiana, and Bill Schmidt from Michigan State. And again, if it's okay with the three of you, we're going to do this in alphabetical order. So that means, Ina, you are first up. Thank you. I know how it feels. Yeah, right.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I want to add my congratulations to everybody else's for all the good, insightful, hard work that the editors, perhaps.
I hope the mic. Is this microphone on? Is it okay? Okay, sorry.
Okay. Congratulations to Judith and Henry for all your good hard work. I participated in the first workshop, and I can't imagine that the second one was sort of similar. So it's quite amazing from that input that you were able to weave such a coherent output. So thank you. I am going to, how do I, oh, the green button.
Push the green button. The big green.
I was going to say there's two. Okay, thanks, Tom. So I am going to begin with an observation, though. So, in actuality, the report doesn't really define what an ILSA is, even though it talks about them, whoever they are. It does give quite a bit of information about the most well-known ILSAs, 2 from IEA, TIMS and PEARLS, and 2 from OECD, PISA and PIAC, but then it continues to talk collectively about ILSAs as if they were all the same. And it's really difficult to know if these collective ILSAs are meant to be the 4, or meant to be the 4 plus some other ones, or meant to be some of the 4. But in any case, there are major differences, and Andreas pointed out some of the major differences in PISA from the report. And my first slide at that first workshop was the point that one size does not fit all when you're talking about the ILSAs. So, and I mentioned this already to Henry, and he suggested that I take some time this morning to talk about some things about TIMS and PEARLS that I think are different from the generalization of ILSAs. So, here is a perspective from TIMS and PEARLS. So, and most of this is in reaction to the discussion of producers and consumers on page 8, and also the first slide that you put up there, Judith. So, first of all, there's little recognition of the essential role of countries. I mean, we wouldn't have any ILSAs if we didn't have a lot of countries doing a lot of work to participate in them. And they are both producers and consumers. And TIMS and PEARLS are, I made up a new term just for this presentation, country-centric. So collaboration with our countries is essential, and we wouldn't be anywhere without them. They collect the data, and for TIMS and PEARLS, they drive project priorities. They also do a lot of the work. They help update the frameworks. In the beginning, they helped make them. Now they help update them. We have a big item writing workshop at the beginning of every cycle. Countries bring their people, we write. And that's one of our most popular meetings, actually. And they also work on the questionnaires. They guide the analysis and the reporting. So they are both, as I say, producers and researchers of TIMS and PEARLS, and we work together on many of these activities. This kind of illustrates how the countries have guided the development of PEARLS' evolution from its founding. In 2001, the idea that IEA had was to measure trends back to the IEA's reading literacy study. And then we were having our first meeting about this task, and the countries are going, actually, we don't want to do that. We now understand that measurement of reading comprehension has changed a lot over the last decade, so we want a new assessment. So we said, okay. And we founded pearls kind of on the spot. And we also offered for countries who wanted to do the original idea of the trend, and some countries did. I think it was about a dozen countries did that too. But mostly everybody got behind the new idea. And it started out in 2001, assessing two purposes for reading, 4 passages each, informational reading and literary reading. Then in 2006, led by initiative by Germany, we added the comprehension processes, and we had to add passages. Everybody had to agree they would do more work to get this. So we did. Then 2011, we had an interesting situation. TIMS is on a 4-year cycle, and Pearls is on a 5-year cycle. And we started out Pearls in the middle of 2 TIMS cycles, but knowing that they would come together, laughing about it because we were sure we would be retired by then. But that, the world changes. And so we're still at it. But anyway, it meant that TIMS and Pearls got assessed together, which was a unique opportunity for good research for reading, math, and science, the integration between them for 4th graders. So the same 4th graders took Pearls and TIMS, according to quite a balanced, rigorous balanced design. And we had a wonderful research base, and more than 30 countries took advantage of that. We also noticed that a lot of developing countries were wanting to join the study, and their students' reading comprehension abilities weren't quite up to being able to take Pearls. So we developed a new, less difficult assessment, which we unfortunately called Pre-Pearls. But yet, so we had 2 big initiatives. Then in 2016, we finally got our Pearls and Pearls literacy straightened out we now have a very comprehensive scale based on 20 passages that will address reading comprehension levels of a number of countries. And also, the countries have been asking, especially led by Denmark, that our definition of reading, our construct, should include online reading. But again, in the research mode, we developed the ePearls to see what we think about this. And we had 5 tasks in 14 countries doing our assessment of online reading, including the United States. And I see Sheila sitting over there. And now we are doing the research at the TIMS and Pearls International Study Center to see the relationship that we found in our assessment data between the ePearls and Pearls. Also, there's been a great mention of transition to digitally based assessment, which we are doing. We're doing it with TIMS as we speak. We're field testing. But again, not all of our countries wanted that. Some can't do it. So we also have paper. We have about half countries doing each. So the country partnerships are fundamental for us. IEA is not a governmental organization, but yet 60 to 70 countries join TIMS and Pearls because they find the data useful for many of the reasons that Andreas was explaining earlier. Also, though, IEA has a different model. The TIMS and Pearls International Study Center is dedicated to doing the work of TIMS and Pearls. And we work then in partnership with the countries to get the work done. And that's what we do 24/7. So now about the key messages. So I think that, these suggestions are very reasonable and wonderful, and I was glad to hear Peggy say she was excited. But, you know, they're hugely expensive, most of them. And we already provide high-quality system-level data at a relatively low cost per student. So IEA doesn't have any extra resources to implement these ideas. However, any country with resources can feel free to implement these ideas, and many of our countries have. We go around the room and share. Every time before a media release, we share what everybody's going to do, and everybody, you know, gets good ideas from other people. Number one favorite idea. France has like a fancy breakfast. And the price for attending the fancy breakfast is getting lessons in what you can and cannot say about the data. And so I don't know how many other countries have instituted the breakfast, but it was considered like quite inventive. Having a board to monitor participation. I never thought of a super board like Tom was talking about. I did resonate to the fact that now we've got 60 to 70 countries that we're trying to please, and, you know, Boston College and IEA. And so I did resonate to the idea that we don't need any more people telling us what to do, but we wouldn't mind it, and we would try to do our best. That's what we do. The apples to apples, anybody who wants can benchmark in Tims and Pearls. And we've had states benchmark, we've had districts benchmark, we've had cities like Madrid and Moscow. So if you want data for a smaller jurisdiction, you can do it. You can conduct extra analyses. As a matter of fact, IEA and ETS have combined to provide seminars in advanced data analysis of international data, Tims, Pearls, and PISA, to look into anything that you like. You could also add a longitudinal aspect. Sort of my favorite was a hybrid that was done by Russia, where Tims is a little lower age group grade than PISA, so they reassessed the Tims people as part of PISA, and then they had that kind of innovative longitudinal aspect. And, you know, supplementing questionnaire data with data from other sources, I think everybody tries to do their best. So, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ina. Leslie Rutkowski from Indiana University.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm going to focus on the 3 C's in general, but especially on the common sense. Green button, big green button. There we go. Okay, usually when I get up here, I forget to say these things, so I wrote it down explicitly. I wanted to say thank you very much to NCES and to the National Academies of Education and the steering committee for inviting me to be here today. And I also need to thank the Norwegian Research Council, who funded a lot of the research that I'm going to talk about today. And I'd like to thank my research group in Oslo and Indiana who brought this research into life. Overarching comments on the report, it's a very well-written survey of international assessments. I really liked, and it's been said before, but I'll just add on, I really like the state of media and the need for messaging and graphics. I also really like the BICSI idea or national report. And I can honestly say that this is going to be a reference that I refer back to, especially with students, but also with colleagues that are interested in learning the landscape of international assessment. I also really liked Ellen Nolte's comment about cross-cultural studies as a method. This is really where I make my money in my career, so I agree very wholeheartedly, and it's where I'm going to focus my comments. There's been massive and ongoing growth in international assessment, and the report highlights significant growth over the past 2 decades. PISA is growing the most aggressively of all of the international studies, the big 3, I would say PISA, Pearls, and TIMS, so I'm going to concentrate here. I just want to say a word on growth and differences. The bottom row is PISA in 2000, where they had 28 OECD countries and 15 partner countries. You can see the differences in the GDP per capita at that time. Go up to 2015, where you have 34 OECD countries. There have been some changes over the years. Now there are 37 partner countries. It's been big growth in the partner countries. And you can also see that there are these persistent gaps in GDP per capita because of the fundamental differences between OECD countries and partner countries. This translates, in one aspect, into achievement diversity. And this is a figure that represents the distribution of achievement in 2015 science across all of the participating countries and jurisdictions. And you can see that this is really spread out across the spectrum of achievement. That PISA reports, as many of you probably know, across achievement levels, where the highest achievement level is level 6, the lowest is 1B. And we also have a number of items. The column I'd like to call the most attention to is this far right column, where you can see the distribution of items across those performance levels. The most items are concentrated in the middle, as you would expect, and out in the tails, the highest levels and the lowest levels, there are far fewer items. This is meaningful for countries that participate, and I'll talk a little bit about why. Here, I just selected a few countries, some of the very lowest performing. Dominican Republic was the lowest in 2015, and I also have a typical high-performing Finland represented here. The columns I'd like to call attention to are the ones that are proportions. So the proportion of the achievement distribution that's below level 2 in the Dominican Republic is 98. It's 31 in Finland. And then when we take the very lowest level, level 1B, 52% of the Dominican Republic's distribution is below that, 2% of Finland's is. So again, very wide differences in achievement. You can also display some of these test performance matches with something that's called a right map. And this shows the distribution of examinee proficiency on the proficiency continuum. I'm a measurement person. I always call proficiency theta. And it's against the probability of a correct response of 0.62. So that locates the item on the same continuum as achievement, and it allows you to talk about those as being on the same scale. Such a representation gives a really nice picture of the degree to which a group of examinees are matched to a test. And to illustrate these points, I also use the functional form of an item response theory model to describe the probabilities of correct answers to examinees along that continuum. So first of all, we have the United States, which I think is really well represented by the PISA test. And why I'm saying that is this plot in the middle is achievement distribution for the United States. What you see down here, this kind of backward S curve, are the items that are across the achievement levels. And these are the probabilities of a correct response at 0.62. So again, this plot matches very well to the items that are in PISA. Finland, you can see their distribution is shifted a little bit to the right, but still, they're hovering over a lot of items that are measuring them on their continuum. But if we take a few of the lower performing countries, Tunisia, their distribution is really shifted to the left. They have far fewer items that are sitting underneath their distribution that are measuring them. And a lot of that distribution is unmeasured. Algeria is an interesting example because they take a paper-based test and there are far fewer items in general in the paper-based assessment. Here, you see there are just a few items that are measuring a big portion of their distribution. And then we have our outlier Dominican Republic, which is measured, most of the distribution is measured by very few items. And to play my own devil's advocate, I'll say, okay, Dominican Republic is an outlier here. They're one of the very lowest performers. But look who's coming to dinner. PISA for Development, you can say there are very different countries that are going to be participating that haven't before, and they're very different than the OECD countries, and they're also quite different than many of the other countries that are participating. As a simulation, we took the Dominican Republic as our population and we simulated some data. We gave our simulated Dominican Republic PISA items, and to see what would happen if we made that test easier for them, we made those items successively easier over increased administrations. And then we correlated that simulated data with a simulated socioeconomic status measure to see how things would shake out if they were given an easier test. What we found, and what I want to call attention to, is this blocked out list of numbers here. Condition 1 is what we actually see in PISA, how hard the items are for the Dominican Republic. This is the true correlation between achievement and socioeconomic status, but this is what we estimate in a test that's too hard for them. And it's an amplified correlation between socioeconomic status and achievement. Then as we go down and the test gets easier, you can see that that correlation gets closer to the truth. So we're misestimating some relationships, important policy relevant relationships, when the test isn't well matched to the group of examinees that are taking the test. So I want to then allude to something that I wasn't sure if this was actually going to happen, but Andreas, you made mention of it, that PISA will become adaptive in the future. So the promise of multi-stage testing is that we can cover a lot more of the continuum with better precision as we go to computerized testing and as we move toward adaptive testing. A few challenges, though, are that item development, so that it's best matched for multi-stage testing, are necessarily going to come into conflict with trend. And the countries that are going to most benefit from very tailored items, these very low-performing, low economically developed countries, are the ones that are going to face the most challenges of technology. So that's something that's going to have to be resolved. And it's also the case that a large number of easy items are necessary. And why I'm saying that is that we did another simulation where we looked at how well easy booklets in PISA could recover proficiency in low-performing countries. In 2009, PISA introduced easy clusters of items for countries that had demonstrated previously low achievement or who were now incoming and that were expected to have low achievement. We found that it took a lot of very easy items to improve matters. So this is kind of a complex plot, and I'm just going to point out a few things. Here in the lower left-hand corner, this black diamond is the situation in PISA before they introduced easy items. And then as you move up and to the right, what I'm representing here is how well the estimated achievement matched what we actually simulated. And when the country is not well matched to the test, and the items are overly difficult, we don't do a good job of recovering the generating or population level achievement levels. But as we increase the number of easy clusters, and as those clusters get easier and easier, we see that we do a better job. But it takes a lot of easy items, and they have to be really easy until we start to recover that true achievement level. So moving forward, I just wanted to comment on a couple of the chapters. Chapter 4 talked about the promise of digitally based assessments. And yes, I think this is absolutely the way forward. I mean, that's obvious. It's hardly even worth commenting about. Along with multi-stage testing proposed in PISA, digitally based assessment is one tractable way to deal with big differences, and big differences in countries that are incoming. I disagree a bit in the report that digitally based assessments will have little effect on research and policy. And why I'm saying that is that because of these measurement issues, thank you, because of these measurement issues and what we see in low performing countries that we're overestimating or perhaps underestimating correlations, then improving that situation, we're going to have a better impact on research and policy. And then the other comment I wanted to make was on Chapter 5, International Assessment for Causal Inference. It's absolutely a laudable goal, but I agree with the preponderance of the comments that were made here for a lot of reasons, and in addition to the evidence that I showed, that until we get the measurement side sorted out, that causal inferences with this data is just unfounded and very dangerously not recommended. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. Great. Well, you asked for methodology and you got it. Bill Schmidt.
Well, thank you for asking me to add some comments to this. I've spent a fair chunk of my life doing these international studies, both with TIMSS and PISA. I thought the report was good. It raises a lot of central issues that I think this country, which is one of the few that participates in almost every one of these international studies you could possibly take, and the millions of dollars associated with it, to actually take a look at it and ask some important questions about what does it tell us, where is it going, and is it constructive to our view of educational policy and educational research. So I want to focus my comments more around that particular end of this. But first of all, because this is one of my greatest pet peeves, I want to stand in support of the reports calling for the dissolution of this silly notion that every 3 or 4 years there is a new number one, and that sets where the Holy Grail is, and then there's a tourist industry that then takes Americans to study and find that Holy Grail with the belief if they bring it back, somehow their educational system will end up being terrific and perfect. The report clearly slams this about as best as you can. But I have a question that shows how more ridiculous this is. Who's on first? If you look across the history of these studies, beginning with the first international math and science study, and you track it all the way through to the 2015, for PISA and for TIMSS, math and science, that's what I want to talk about because that's where I've done my work. What you find is that if you take only the total test score in a population, because in TIMSS there are multiple populations, 24 countries in mathematics have achieved the top 5 status. In science, 28 countries have achieved that status over one test in one population at one point in time. So who is number one is really not so clear as you might think. Finland got that title a couple years ago. You want to know the secret? They were never number one. With the year they claimed that Chinese Taipei outperformed them. So it's an interesting thing how that all develops. But I want to get more serious and talk about the implications of this report for studying the role of schooling across the world, because I think that's really how this all began. So I want to digress for 1 second to a little bit of history. About 60 years ago, a set of 5, 6 university researchers, mainly at the University of Chicago, decided that comparative education only had qualitative, ethnographic, anthropological type data. And there was a need for quantitative data if you're going to study different educational systems. So they got together, set up a study with about 12 countries, with borrowed items from the University of Chicago Examiner's Office with a small budget, and set out to do what now deals with half of the world. I checked this out. Half of the world's countries have participated in one of these math or science international assessments. 102, I think it is the exact number. And so this all began a long time ago. And I think I want to do this at least, to acknowledge the stellar, outstanding people. None of you are going to ask me who's that. These are the people who were so central in that. Benjamin Bloom, Arthur Fauché, Torsten Hussein, Robert Thorndike, John Carroll, Ralph Tyler, James Coleman, and even George Rasch, who actually was at that time beginning to introduce the Rasch model in the IRT. Those were all the people that were engaged in those early efforts to establish these studies. And they began. But what I want to mainly say, which is the main point I want to talk about today, is what was so central, the hallmark of all of those IEA studies, and now with PISA in 2012 in mathematics, they all had measures of opportunity to learn. Call it the curriculum, call it content coverage. It's about schooling. John Carroll's model had 3 elements: a student with motivation, a teacher with the background to teach that, and the curriculum, which the country stipulates and which teachers implement. That was the hallmark of all of those studies. And they found 2 big findings. One, there's a tremendous variation in mathematics. Ironically, the founding fathers started to study in math because they thought math was common pretty much across the countries. But what you find is there's a tremendous variation across countries, within countries. Actually, there's more variation within countries typically than between. And within countries, there's variation between schools and within schools. And most of the variation is usually within schools in opportunity to learn. So you cannot make the assumption that those classes, even within the same country, have the same opportunity. And therefore, how do you interpret the achievement if that be the case? I want to point out and connect this idea with another one. And by the way, I find it sad that this report really does not deal with that issue. It omits what I think is one of the most fundamental issues of international research. However, I thank Judy for including it in the science article that you wrote, where there is a reference to that particular way of looking at these international studies. I bring it up in the context of the arguments about causality, again, I totally with the report as to the problems with trying to establish a causal inference. But one that sits with this opportunity to learn business is it's so central, logically, to what students learn. You're not going to know any calculus if you've never experienced it. I don't care how bright you are. So there is that linkage that's logical. If you omit it and then study other variables and their relationship to performance, you have a biased set of coefficients if any of those things you're studying are related to the curriculum. And if you look at the major variables, people are interested in motivation, teachers' characteristics, those are all correlated with what curriculum. The best teachers in the country are often those that teach the more advanced kids. So if you don't disentangle those, if you don't have an OTL measure in your model, you're going to end up with seriously biased coefficients. But also that goes along with another point, a close point that I want to, and I'd like to just read this to you. This is a comment that David Wiley, who's been involved in these international studies over time. From our perspective, the effects of education are strongly cumulative, and all of the learnings that have been attained by a particular age or stage of schooling is a consequence of what goes on before. Only if longitudinal study designs are used is it conceptually possible to isolate the effects that occur within that given year. And even that's methodologically very difficult. As a consequence, explanations of cross-sectional data on learning must take care of and account for that continuous cumulative exposure across the years of schooling. That brings up one thing in the report that I also wanted to comment on. They talk about the desirability of longitudinal studies. Only the second math study ever really achieved that with a limited set of countries. But they talk also about these taking several, you saw it earlier, I think, with your summary, with putting several cross sections together. But there's another point that I think is missed in the report, and it was done in the original 95 TIMS. The taking of a synthetic cohort. You take, within a school, you sample 7th graders and 8th graders, for example. And if you make the assumption within the school that the population of 7th graders is like the population of 8 in most characteristics, that can be used as a covariate or an initial pretest, if you will. That's something that doesn't solve the problem of causality. I'm not arguing that that produces a causal inference, but it certainly provides a better situation than not having any kind of a pre-measure. But all of that comes to what I think is the biggest implication and the biggest problem with the studies now. If you take that quote from Wiley, the studies are misaligned. Asking questions of students as to what happened in their current course in mathematics and then trying to relate that is fatally flawed. There's no way that that's going to have the impact on the performance. If the performance is cumulative, then asking questions about the current situation simply only picks up a piece of a larger set of effects that would relate to performance on that test. And so what does that imply? Questionnaires should most likely be more cumulative in nature and try to assess the full length. We were able to do that in PISA 2012 because the opportunity measure we had traversed across all of the grades. Mathematics is very hierarchical. It's easier to do there than in other subject matters. But there are ways to do this, which you try to gather your opportunity to learn data in a more cumulative fashion, which then enables you to relate it to measures which themselves are also performance measures, which are also cumulative in nature. And so I think that's a very important implication of what this study is about and the causes, the cautions about causality. But I think, once again, the major point I want to make is one cannot ignore what students study, what the country says they should, and what the teachers actually implement. That has a powerful impact on what it is that students learn. Every one of those studies over those 60 years that included those kinds of measures found statistically significant relationships. And the most recent one, the PISA 2012, where that was introduced for the first time, the most powerful relationships were related, somewhat surprisingly to me, it was not my hypothesis, that the amount of exposure to mathematics, more advanced mathematics, and the amount of exposure was the one that was most significantly related to PISA performance on a literacy test. We also had opportunity measures with respect to their exposure to applied problems. It was statistically significant, even controlling for the formal school mathematics. But its relationship was not as strong as was the case for the formal math, which is a caution to those who suggest, some in this country, especially in the Netherlands, that all mathematics should be taught within the applied context. Because in effect, when you look at the relationship of applied OTL, it's nonlinear. It hits a point after which more actually is negatively related to performance. So there are very subtle things you can learn from these kinds of things which enhance our ability to understand more about. Again, the problem exists the same as with others in terms of causal inference. But I would sort of argue that if you take and find that relationship to hold in 60-some countries with all the different variations in structure and that there are, and the only thing that varies is the magnitude of that coefficient, that's a bit like a good quasi-experimental approach, because you're taunting the coefficient in that sense by challenging it by multiple different systems under multiple different structures with different children from different backgrounds, different languages. And you find that, I think there's evidence there that's somewhat comparable to all of the fancy economic things of fixed effects and discontinuity analysis and all of those. It sits in that same category, I would argue. Perhaps one of the best advantages of international research. Just 3 other quick points. One, with 2 minutes, that should be good. One is, I would have liked to have seen some recognition in the report, and Henry, your report, about the implications of this. And I've written a book for Cambridge Press on international assessments in math and science. So I've done a lot of thinking about this over the last 2 years. And Andreas gave a very good additional case where the impact on policy was strong. But we also have one in our own country, where in fact the Common Core state standards or the college and career ready standards were heavily influenced by the research part of the original TIM study in '95. And I think that is missed as a good example of a powerful impact of the curriculum component of that original study. The second thing I want to just quickly mention is tracking. It's present, and it's mentioned in the report, but I think its importance is never emphasized enough. I think in this country, we should always, anytime we're doing NAEP or any other study, be taking into account the tracking. I don't know if it's still present, but in the earlier years it was. Now the Common Core is designed to remove it, but I don't believe it has. That produces a big variance component which gets confounded in these studies with classrooms, teachers, and other things. And some research we did based off of the original TIM study, although that is time dated, I think it's still present, and that is after you take out the selection effect for being in a different track, that's about 20% of it. Then you go to 40% of it has to do with opportunity to learn, and about an additional 20% for motivation and other factors. So I think that really needs to become part, and more countries do it than I think they are willing to admit. Lastly, all studies should make sure of any subject matter that you have the people who know the subject matter best as a part of that study, so that you need mathematicians, scientists in doing and designing these instruments and things of that sort. It's not often mentioned, but without it, you end up with somewhat silly questions, which later on the mathematicians take aim at and criticize. So the way to deal with that is to make sure that such individuals are part of the research team. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bill. So good, let's open this up, and if there are comments, questions, disagreements, factual adjustments that one would like to propose, or others? Anything? Andreas?
This is just sort of a small factual issue. You presented sort of the PISA for development countries as just being merged into the PISA test. Actually, the test that we give those countries is very different. We developed over 50% of the items on the easy side precisely to map, and actually after the field trial we can verify that the mapping is really well. So the adaptive testing from 2018 onwards, we will be able to represent the whole ability range across those two. So I think that's an important point. The other point you made, that's an interesting observation. You know that digital delivery will penalize low-income countries. Actually, we have observed exactly the opposite. When you test mathematics, for example, those are the countries that benefits most. You give in the Dominican Republic students a paper-based and the digital test, and actually doing, in relative terms, better on the digital tests. Young people are actually more able to solve problems on a digital platform than reading long texts about math and then solving the math problem on paper. That's at least what we saw.
I think my broader comment about technology isn't the way in which an individual student would interact with it, but in Cambodia, stability of electricity is an issue. So if you're administering something computer-based, or if you're relying on a network to be able to deliver that, that's going to pose problems and challenges that are unique to less economically developed countries. And then the other thing about the PISA for development, yeah, I absolutely agree that, as you said, there are a lot of items that are specifically for them. What we've shown through our simulation is it still may not be enough to really be able to capture what's going on in those countries, and those items, how easy those items are, again, may still not be enough. And I think that that's something that methodological research can be really informative for, and that we should test those assumptions to make sure that there are enough and that they're easy enough to do a good job of capturing those contexts.
I know, sure.
So, Bill, I want to thank you. I had, until I got the sit down now sign, intended also to acknowledge the founders of those first international, oh, sorry, Stevenson, I need to talk into the microphone instead of at Bill. But I want to thank him anyway for acknowledging the initial founders of this amazing idea, because I wanted to do that. And I wanted to especially do it in the context of a couple of things. One, they were more 20% for the achievement and picked math, and 80% for the background factors that could be influencing that achievement. That was their goal. Their goal was not to measure math. Their goal was not to rank countries. They probably are rolling over in their graves when they hear about these ILSAs and, you know, being in headlines and stuff. That was like so far removed from anything they were about that, you know, it's almost unbelievable, really. So thank you.
To add to Ina's comment, which is remarkable, in writing this book, you know, I've been involved in some of that, so I took some pride in it. And what it was is really humbling, because all the issues we just have been talking about, that report they wrote 60 years ago, they cautioned against horse race. They talked about the need for all this extra contextualizing information, not just OTL, but SES, all these other things. They pushed for that. They warned about the sampling. That was their big problem, and countries could not pull off the sampling. That was what they learned in their pilot study. So they just kept talking about all these issues we now talk about. Causality, they worried about that. That people would draw causal inferences. One of their examples was, how could you draw that about Sweden at that time, because Sweden didn't have algebra in the 8th grade, yet the US did. They thought, but that's not true either. But anyway, they just made all of these points that are now in this report, and we've all talked about it and we all believe in, and that was 60 years ago. They saw it coming, and they cautioned us. And maybe not so sure we paid attention to them as we built up this machinery. But if you look at also the machinery buildup, there were 5 or 6 of these people doing this and pulling it off in all these countries. Now we have big organizations, OECD, IEA, millions of dollars spent. You've got this George Roche. Now the modified versions of the Roche model are what are being used to scale these things. What I thought of after writing this was they had all these ideas. We just improved the methodology and the machinery to do it.
Thank you, Bill. Did you want to get in on this again, Judith? Thank you.
Just one comment and then one question. The comment is, remember, this was the day of some punch cards. And so all of these things were on IBM cards, which had to be sorted in a sorter and then carted across the campus in order to be analyzed and then carted back. And my office was next door to Dick Wolf's, and you could hardly walk into Dick Wolf's office because he was the person who was in charge of these punch cards. And yet these, you're quite correct that the purpose of this was to create, in Torsten Hussein's term, a science of education. It was not to, raise any particular country to be thought of as the model for what was going on. Thank you.
You didn't mention is those computers at that point in time, it would probably take them a week to run what we now run in short time to scale all this.
Room, at least, in size.
Well, let me just, if I might, just want to share with you a couple of the themes that I think may have emerged from this morning's conversation, and then I'm going to ask Judy and Henry to come up and have the last word and the farewell, at least for today. One theme clearly has to do with the difference between sort of a point in time and longitudinal analysis of something as complicated as achievement. And I'm reminded of this because Bill pointed out that one hears frequently about, which country was number one then and which country is number one today. And there is a tendency on the part of people who look at these results to sort of pine for the golden age when they think we were doing so much better. You hear that a lot. You see that. Why can't today's kids do as well as we did back then? Which brings to mind the poet Randall Jarrell, who once said that people who live in the golden age frequently complain about how yellow everything looks. And it's, I think, worth keeping in mind that a lot of these inferences about change over time are problematic, and one needs to be a little cautious. So that's what I was reminded of that listening to some of the conversation. The second big problem, of course, has to do with causality. And, I learned from one of the great theorists of causal inference, Paul Holland, who once said that not all questions are causal. And I think that's something that's worth remembering, in particular about these international large-scale assessments, that there's a whole lot of really interesting things one can learn without necessarily feeling this pressure to look for causal connections in these data. But that's a little bit like asking people to not do things that may be bad for them, even though they will keep doing them. And we should just keep reminding ourselves that there are interesting questions that are worth asking, and that some of the causal questions this technology isn't yet actually able to support. On the business of rankings, I just have to share this one story to show you how pervasive this business of league tables and rankings and who's on first, this mentality, how pervasive this is, and I'm not sure what to do about it except we should acknowledge it. But over here in Bethesda, I don't want to name the name of it, but there's a Montessori school. Now, as a rather crude approximation, the Montessori philosophy doesn't exactly promote competition. It has a different sense of how children learn and grow and develop and how to promote that. But in front of this Montessori school, there's a big sign, and you can see it if you're going up Wisconsin Avenue, that this particular Montessori school is rated #1 of Montessori schools in the region. I always thought, well, there you go. I mean, go fight this spirit of ranking. Finally, I think the most important thing that comes from all of this for me is about the phrase that I think, I'm not sure which of our speakers used, it may have been Pablo, but I think it came across in all of the remarks, and that has to do with the so-called culture of evidence. What do we really mean by that? And that's where this business of policy and research really needs to be thought of almost at the same time. Because for me, the culture of evidence suggests that evidence should be viewed as a process rather than as a fixed decision and as a fixed conclusion. And what this, I think, report does so eloquently and elegantly is promote exactly the kind of approach to evidence that I think we need, especially if we go forward in international assessment, which I hope we do. And that is rather than be either frustrated that there are, imperfections in this, to look on the side of what we are learning from these things and how we can promote exactly this kind of ongoing conversation. The appetite for evidence of any sort these days, here and elsewhere in the world, is a little bit low right now, but I think the appetite will return, and I think promoting the kind of dialogue that's implied in this report is going to be very important, because otherwise we're not going to have much to offer as a research community to the people who are actually doing the hard work of trying to make education better. So there's got to be some continuation of this sort of thing. Anyway, I've found this to be a truly, even though I had something to do with it at its inception, I didn't have too much to do with the writing. I didn't have anything to do with the writing of the report. I just want to commend you again and thank you on behalf of the rest of my colleagues in the Academy, of which you two are members after all, about what a great piece of work this is. You want to come up here and sort of close us out with whatever reflections you might. Oh, they can fit in here. I'll get out of the way. Oh, you want to do it standing? That's even better.
Yeah, let me do it standing. So, both Henry and I want to thank everyone for both coming out here and also participating in this exercise. Really want to thank the panelists, and a special word of thanks, frankly, to Ina and to Andreas, because it's not easy to come here and respond to a report that raises issues about the work that you have dedicated your lives to. So your graciousness is very much appreciated. I think what we've seen today is a variety of perspectives on these questions, depending on where you sit in the ecosphere, which makes perfect sense. If you're coming in from a particular point of view, you have a point of view, it's very well developed, and it's hard to move off a dime. I'll tell you about the conversation I had with Michael when he asked me to chair this panel. I said, I have never written anything about international assessments. And he said, and that's why I'm asking you. This has been a very interesting project for me especially. Henry knows a lot about international assessments. I came in much more as a tabula rasa. What you see is that reasonable people can disagree. And I think that's healthy. We don't all have to have the same perspective. And I think today has been a very productive conversation airing issues. The workshops were as well, and the report tries to bring out some of these different perspectives. There's obviously different points of view on the purposes of ILSAs and what can and can't be said. And depending upon where you're coming from, you might go further in one direction or further in another direction. And I think that's what we're seeing here in part. Many measurement issues and ideas have come up today that are even beyond the report, and I certainly hope that they continue to be pursued. Certainly this move to digital-based assessments, I mean, Judith's how many people remember punch cards? Okay, I even remember ticker tape, before punch cards. So this notion that the move to digital-based assessments is, sort of like the next frontier. We don't even know what the next frontier is going to be. So when they put little hats on our heads and start measuring what's going on. This question about inferences and causal inferences in particular is not unique to international assessments. People have very different points of view on what kind of evidence would need to be brought to bear before you can make a causal claim. And so it comes up in this context because the ability to design the studies that would lead you more comfortably to a causal inference is not going to happen in this particular sphere. And several people have reminded us of the costs of these assessments. They're expensive. So we all have wish lists of what we would like to see, but there are trade-offs as well, and I think we're seeing that. And then I'm going to turn it over to Henry to make a few more remarks.
Thank you. I just want to add my thanks to Judy's, to everybody here, and particularly to the staff of the National Academy of Education, Greg White in particular, who's helped bring this all together. I want to, again, echo what Judy said, that part of the hope from this whole project is this kind of conversation, discussion, and even edging into debate, because this is really what's going to move the field forward. I want to just touch on three topics or three issues that were brought up. The first with Andreas talking, I think very appropriately, about the issue of trade-offs. When I teach test design, my little mantra is that test design is an exercise in optimization under constraints. And that's what really we're talking about, trade-offs. The neat thing, though, is that what seems to be a trade-off under a current regime can turn out to be not a very big trade-off when you change the game. So I think moving from paper and pencil to digitally based assessments is going to change the nature of the trade-off. There'll be other trade-offs, but things that we felt we were really stuck on turn out not to be sticking points because the technology allows us, for example, in adaptive testing, to test a broader range of assessments that are more student-centered rather than test-centered. Ina makes, I think, a very important point that we were unable in a way to fully flesh out in the report, and that is these different assessments, and they're more than just the four big ones, each have a unique constituency, they have a unique context in which they play out their roles, and they have somewhat different trajectories in terms of where they're heading. And I think when we think about policy regarding international assessments, we need to retain our appreciation of that individuality, not treat them as a undifferentiated whole. The third point, I want to come here to Bill Schmidt's point around curriculum, opportunity to learn, tracking, and so on. These are all part of the hidden mass of, or what we might call unobserved heterogeneity, to use the economist terms. And I think he is right to remind us that even in the most sophisticated analyses that we are able to do with all of the background information we now measure, there are some very important variables that we don't measure at all that may be only imperfectly correlated with what we measure, and therefore represent a source of very substantial uncertainty. And we need to retain our humility in the face of that uncertainty as we try to make even cautious pronouncements about what works, what doesn't work, or even about the relationships between certain outcomes and certain contextual factors. And we make those comparisons across countries because that unobserved heterogeneity could really be shifting those comparisons from one country to the next. So I think it's a warning that's well taken, and one that is well to be maintained as we think about the kinds of research that we love to do. And I'll just finish by again saying thank you to the National Academy of Education, and wish you all well, and hope that you will in fact join us in continuing discussion and the ever increasing importance and strength of international assessments for education. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to mention that at AURA next Sunday, a week from Sunday, we're going to have a panel that includes some of the people here, and we would welcome any of you who are in New York on a Sunday morning to come join us and to continue the conversation. I think strategies for continuing the conversation are something that we need to be thinking about, whether it's a really interesting idea to have an international board, and that's an idea that could be taken up, a national board could be taken up. Got to start somewhere. Having spent the last 3 years working on this project, to just have it end now is not the best outcome. So I hope everybody here joins us in continuing this conversation and continuing the debate, because we think that this is a very important topic. The ILSs are here. They are not going away. So improving them and improving their dissemination is a really important commitment that I think we all need to make. So thank you.
Not bad for somebody who's never touched international comparative assessment. Thank you so much. Judy, Henry, great stuff. We are adjourned.